It is Friday night. No parking permits are needed, so don't worry about parking. They will not be monitored. That's true on Saturdays and Sundays also. So if you ever visit Fresno State after 4 o'clock on Fridays or Saturdays or Sundays, you don't need a parking permit. So that's one thing I want to remind you of. Well, welcome to this evening's final lecture in the Armenian Studies Program Fall Lecture Series. And I see many faces that have been with us all the way through this semester. And it's amazing to think that we're in the month of December already, because we started in August with a lecture by Dr. Bedros Dermatosyan. And since then, we've had 10 events. So we've had a full semester, a variety of speakers. And if you are interested in finding out about our next semester, we're already building in our next semester's lecture series. And we have quite a variety of speakers coming. A photographer, Harar Khacherian, who has photographed Armenian churches and monuments in Artsakh and in Armenia, will be coming with some beautiful photographic books. That's in February. We're going to have also in February a book talk. We're going to have Dr. Taner Akjam coming in the spring. We'll have some movies, and we'll have also some musical presentations. So all of these are planned for the spring semester. And so it's always nice that we are in December and thinking about next semester, but we're at the end of the semester. Some of you were asking me about the semester, and yesterday and today were consultation days. There were no classes, and classes ended on Wednesday, and so next Monday begins finals, and we have finals on Monday through Thursday of next week, and then the semester really ends, except for turning in the grades. And we won't start again until, I believe, January 17th, so we have a little bit of a break. I'm very pleased tonight to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Ümit Kurt, who has been a pretty frequent visitor to Fresno. It turns out we were talking that he hasn't been here in 4 years, and it seems like he usually comes more often than that, but with the COVID and all the other things, we just haven't had a chance to bring him. But he tonight will be speaking on the topic of the microhistories of the Armenian Genocide. And generally when we think of the Armenian Genocide, we understand it's an event of mass violence. But we generally think of it through the eyes of the leaders, that is the government or the political parties which organized it. But what Dr. Kurt and other historians are now doing is analyzing the genocide through the lens of individual actors and the agency that they had. And that makes individual responsibility also part of the Armenian Genocide. So you can have orders in Istanbul, but how did the genocide take place, in particular in Aintab, where Dr. Kurt is a specialist and has done work in that area. So he wants to try to construct, and he and other historians, a new paradigm to shift the focus from the Committee of Union and Progress, which we know was the organizing party and the political party in power, but to construct that new paradigm and to look at the local elites and how they acted and why they acted, what were their motivations. Some it was economic greed, for others it was positions, and there's a whole variety of reasons that he's explored in some of his previous talks and also in his book. But I'll leave the rest of that to his talk tonight. Let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Kurt. He's an assistant professor in the School of Humanities, Creative Industry, and Social Sciences, and an affiliate of the Center for the Study of Violence at the University of Newcastle in Australia. I had to look up Newcastle when I was talking to him, but one time I talked to him by Zoom and I saw the ocean in the background, so he's actually living in a nice city. It's a nice university town, but it's a couple of hours away at least from Sydney, which is the capital, or not capital, but the largest city in Australia. He is formerly a Polonsky Fellow at the Van Leer Institute in Jerusalem, where he was a research fellow for 5 years. And during that time, he's produced a number of books, and the most recent one had just been published in Harvard Press, and has been an award-winning book, is called The Armenians of Aintab, The Economics of Genocide in an Ottoman Province. And that's exactly what I was talking about, right? The microhistory of the genocide in one particular city. He's also the co-author of The Spirit of the Laws, The Plunder of Wealth in the Armenian Genocide. And he has co-edited with Ara Sarafian and myself 2 books in our series of conferences. The first was the 2020 Armenians and Kurds in the Late Ottoman Empire, and then in 2021, the Committee of Union and Progress founders, ideology, and structure. And we just sent to press our third book in the series of conferences and our 17th book in the Armenian series, and that is going to be called The Early State of the Turkish Republican Period, Historiography and the Future of that. That book should be out probably in January, and myself and Dr. Kurt and Aras Arafian are co-editors of that book. So without any further introduction, I'd like to welcome and have all of us welcome Dr. Ümit Kurt. Dr. Kurt?
You guys hear me okay? Good. All right. Thank you very much for such a generous introduction, and it's really great to be back in Fresno. It's kind of a second home for me after Aintab, where I was born and raised, grown up. So I would like to thank Professor Mugardician and Professor Sergio Laporta for our main studies program at Fresno State University, and also special thanks to Professor Mugardician for as a lifetime advisor, lifetime supporter, and I'm really indebted to him a lot over the course of my whole academic career, and I'm really want to express my gratitude for his endless support and cooperation as well. So today my focus would be the microhistories of the Armenian Genocide. But before that, I would like to also talk about my personal story, how I got engaged in the this particular time period and this particular subject matter within the framework of Aintab or at the provincial level as well. So, so let's go back to my own history. In 2009, I was working towards a PhD in political science and international relations at Istanbul's Boğaziçi University. I attended a lecture and 2 courses, but I was rudderless, let's say. The readily available research topics all fell to safety, nested in kind of a sterile academia. Searching for something with a flesh and blood connections to Turkey's past, my past, and my very own upbringing as a quote-unquote Turk, let's say, I learned more of the mass atrocities and forced deportations carried out in the waning years of the Ottoman Empire, as well as of the early purges conducted by the Ottoman ruling elite against non-Muslim groups within the empire, Armenians first and foremost, in the late 19th and early 20th century. Henceforth, I gravitated towards genocide studies. I was raised by a Kurdish mother and an Arab father, but learned none of their mother tongues. My father never let my mother speak Kurdish with me and my siblings. He grew up a Turkish Muslim person par excellence. Presumably, it was the only way for him and his Arab family from Aleppo to survive in Turkey. As a little kid, I used to eavesdrop while my mother was speaking Kurdish with my grandmother and aunties. When my father came in, the conversation suddenly switched to Turkish. This led me to develop a certain kind of resistance to everything about Turkishness and the nationalism surrounding it. My underlying curiosity was to reimagine late 19th century and early 20th century Ottoman history through a critical lens by drawing upon alternative sources. In doing so, I hope to contribute to advancing the stalled discussion surrounding the quote-unquote Armenian question, Ermeni sorunu, in the Turkish official historiography. A long overdue reckoning with the Turkish national identity. As I immerse myself in the literature and explore primary sources from Ankara to Aintab to Yerevan, it became clear to me that forced displacement, rhetoric used by the Turkish state to fend off international accusations of the genocide, and the potential Armenian demands for reparations in their eyes, was a tactic in the systematic and planned effort to annihilate Ottoman Armenians in Asia Minor. The picture that emerged through my research was that the massacres that took place during the Armenian deportations were not executed only by a small rank and file of the Committee of Union and Progress, the ruling Ottoman party at the time, but in fact, it had a significant support from the general public, including the involvement of communal figures coming from different walks of life in the empire. Following this thread of inquiry, I sought to uncover the stories of local elites, social figures, and ordinary men in Anatolia. After an examination of the existing literature on this topic, I recognized that the lack of original work on this component was a stunning gap in the academia's study of the Armenian genocide. Discussion of the Armenian issue in Turkey is dominated by claims of atrocities committed by Armenian groups against Muslims, reflecting a position that official Turkish historiography imposes on our collective memory in Turkey. On the rare occasions when the revisionist Turkish historians conceded that Armenians were indeed massacred, the proclivity is often to fall back the false equivalency discourse of but the Armenians killed the Turks too. This phenomenon can be viewed as a natural instinct of individuals and societies in Turkey to disassociate themselves from wrongdoings in order to alleviate the feelings of guilt. Understandably, maybe not understandably, it's difficult for a society like Turkey to talk openly about crimes that are claimed to have been committed for the good of the nation, for the sake of the nation, although as individuals they may not have taken part or even approved of such actions. To have this conversation is to open the door to confronting collective responsibility. While investing the history of Armenian genocide, I uncovered the problematic roots of Turkish national identity and how many of Turkey's current problems can be traced back to these events. Notably, the construction and the visibility of Turkish national identity was made possibly by the destruction and erosion of other identities such as Assyrian, Greek, Arab, Kurdish, and of course Armenian. Its existence required the negation of other identities, which brings to mind Raphael Lemkin's description of the two phases of genocide as follows. One, destruction of the national pattern of the oppressed group. The other, imposition of the national pattern of the oppressor. Growing up a multilingual household but being taught only Turkish, I was living a manifestation of the national pattern of the oppressor, which continued over the course of my entire education. My awakening began in late 2009 by questioning one of the most taboo issues in Turkish political history, that of the quote-unquote Armenian question. I reoriented my PhD studies to the Armenian genocide and the concomitant exploration of the how and why of the hegemony of the official denialist ideology and the widespread lack of expertise necessary for supervising genuine scholarship made this a risky quest for a student in Turkey. Consequently, I choose to pursue my doctorate in the United States, where I will be granted intellectual freedom unavailable in Turkey, by studying at a Clark University under the supervision of Taner Akçam, a renowned scholar of the Armenian genocide. Embarking on my PhD in the Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University was a crucial turning point for me in breaking with any residual influences of the Turkish official ideology, which nearly universally pervades all research in the country relating to issues deemed sensitive or detrimental to state interests. Home to a uniquely rich landmark doctoral program, Clark provided me an opportunity to conduct original research, generate new knowledge, learn relevant methodologies in historiography, and to develop skills needed for independent research on genocide, mass atrocities, crime against humanity, and their prevention. In the course of my PhD training, I mastered the vast literature on the most infamous genocide in history, the Shoah, Holocaust. I learned that for decades, Holocaust historians have been raising questions on the nature of human behavior that pertain to every case of mass violence. But why do people come to commit such brutal acts? From the first day of my investigation into why and how the genocide was perpetrated in my hometown of Aintab, I wish to be able to pose this question to Muslim civilians who executed their Armenian neighbors during the genocidal rule of the CUP regime, those members of the CUP whose single-party dictatorship lasted from 1913 to 1918, but whose middle-level personnel and influence endured into the Turkish Republic. Until the late 1990s, Middle East studies programs in the English-speaking world were dominated by scholars who refused to admit that there was an Armenian genocide. It was they who were training their graduate students like Stanford Shaw, Bernard Lewis, writing reviews like Andrew Mungo, and publishing books which would then be cited like Justin McCarthy, creating an academic loop. In recent years, in the field of Armenian genocide studies, once left the cultural essentialist and descriptive studies, represented by Vahakan Dadrian, Christopher Walker, U.S. Ternon, and Robert Nelson, has exploded. Important works have been produced by Richard Hovhannisyan, Raymond Kevorkian, Hans-Lukas Kieser, and Donald Bloxham. Significantly, a growing number of Turkish and Kurdish scholars have contributed to reshaping our understanding of the Armenian genocide. Historians such as Fuat Dündar, Ümit Kurt, and Taner Akçam have pioneered our understanding the relationship between the demographic engineering and the Armenian genocide. Much of the literature on the destruction of the Ottoman Armenians tells the story of a state captured by a radical party that then enforced genocidal measures throughout the empire. Although elite scholarship on genocidal activity at the local level, you might describe it as, the periphery as well, is still in its infancy. A number of studies have appeared on the local dynamics and the causes of violence, as well as the role of communal social figures in the Armenian genocide. The vast corpus of works on intercommunal strife in the Ottoman Empire and the modern Middle East consist of individual case studies that focus on the specificity of each case. Existing studies unfold the narrative of the annihilation of the Armenians and other minority communities primarily from the perspective of the perpetrators, central political elites, and the European political actors, rather than from the intersecting perspectives of the international, national, and local agents. The current historiography also suffers from a lack of primary sources on the ethnic groups subjected to that violence, Armenians, Greeks, and Assyrians. Although some recent works take into account of the perspective of the victims and they make use of their sources, but most reconstruct the history of violence solely through the prism of the Ottoman and European sources. So the profile of the Armenian genocide historiography has increased in the Western academic sphere with the development of comparative genocide studies in general and Holocaust studies in particular. However, in comparison with the Holocaust, as well as other genocidal acts and mass murders such as in Rwanda and Cambodia under Khmer Rouge regime, we have to date essentially no substantial understanding of the motives of the grassroots perpetrators who enabled and enacted the Armenian genocide. We know little of what drove Muslim men and women to consent and to participate in the mass killings of Armenians. As my research demonstrates, this lack of information on the motives leading to the destruction of Armenians is because such information is usually extracted through a systematic study of the archival resources, testimonial accounts, trial records, and the perpetrator accounts. After Nazi Germany was vanquished in the Second World War, scholars have had unfettered access to the numberless documents produced by the regime, resulting in a profusion of studies of the agents of Shoah. In stark contrast, the Ottoman archives were sealed, disinformation was spread, and those who could speak the truth, for whatever reasons, did not. In totality, these factors have posed great challenges for historians, but progress is being made. One such instance is the work of Hans-Lukas Kieser in organizing workshops in Zurich, which resulted in an edited volume, The End of the Ottomans, published in spring 2019. Chapters in the book shed light on the perpetrators on the ground and proactive collaborators spanning across localities such as Ankara, Artvin, Ardahan, Bitlis, Yozgat, and Aintab. The Armenian genocide was a mass violence event committed by a wide-ranging group of perpetrators. The individuals who were involved in this atrocity did so in line with their own decision, regardless of the circumstances, making individual responsibility a pertinent concept. Alleging that this mass violence was committed only by a group headed by the CUP or Talat Pasha causes us to disregard the aggregate dimension of the genocide itself as well as the individual and collective responsibilities of those who partook of their own free will. It becomes necessary to construct a new paradigm in this regard by shifting our point of focus from CUP elites to local and grassroots perpetrators, as Professor Bugirdichyan has pointed out, as the responsibility for the destruction of Ottoman Armenians is not limited to merely the central government, CUP dignitaries or Talat Pasha. Research into microhistory of the Armenian genocide has made use of various often neglected or overlooked primary sources to shed light on the fate of survivors as well as the many more who perished. Rather than relying on the secondary literature examining this part of Asia Minor with a macro-level focus, uncovering underutilized archival documents grants passage to the largely unknown world of the localities. So most studies of the Armenian genocide, and more generally of violence in Anatolia, miss the local dimension and focus on grand politics and the machinations within the CUP. What we need is more work which has the potential to change thoroughly the way we understand this incident and provide new insights on local agency and the role of local societies in the perpetration of this atrocity. In fact, it's more meaningful to examine the functioning of the mechanisms of collective violence in order to understand the layered and intricate structure of the genocidal process. I believe this more clearly illustrates the environment that constitutes the pillars of the mechanisms of violence as aftershocks and ultimately explosions, which I call a kind of theater of violence, so to speak. Among the main motivations that mobilize the perpetrators who participate in organized acts of evil, such as genocide and mass killings, there is of course the aim to seize the property and assets belonging to the victims, as well as to benefit from the political and economic privileges provided to them by the power bloc that will be established after the destruction. Ordinary perpetrators, along with their performance in these acts of extremism, reinforce their personal interest to the extent of any support and consent they give to the power that plans and organizes these acts. Here we are confronted with the banality of many of the perpetrators who actively take part in the act of genocide, and Hannah Arendt defines this as banality of evil in the context of the Holocaust. Here the relationship between the perpetrator and violence comes to such a point that the perpetrator believes that his or her action is not an accessory to a crime, but rather a normal duty. In my work, I have tried to understand under what circumstances and in what kind of social environment many ordinary people can or are transformed into killing machines. Of course, the actors who carry out genocides and acts of collective extermination, which are the result of large-scale processes, are involved in these processes with extremely different and multiple goals and motives. In addition, these motivations may change in genocidal process and moment. Another point to be emphasized here is the state of irresponsibility created by being a genocidal subject for the perpetrator. Ordinary perpetrators do not feel that the acts they are involved in constitute a crime or are morally wrong because in their eyes they are right and justified. This is the point that needs to be explained. Characterizing these people as sadists, psychopaths, abnormals, and claiming that they have become this way because of the traumas that they have experienced in their past is insufficient to explain how these ordinary people can turn into perpetrators of mass murder. Being the perpetrator of a mass crime, such as genocide, is not unique to certain individuals. In this respect, there are transitivities, flexibilities between the perpetrators and their motivations. None came into this world as perpetrators. In this respect, there might be an opportunist and conformist agent who took a position according to the situation, the person and the conjuncture, as an agent who was deeply tied to the unionist ideology, maybe a careerist agent who aspired to rise to the upper echelons of the state, for example, from a simple military dispatch clerk to a parliamentarian and member of an independent court. Even if it's possible to describe the act of genocide as an organized evil, I do not claim that perpetrators are equipped with such an evil. In fact, this is an answer to why perpetrators of mass acts of violence such as genocide consider their actions as ordinary. At the local level, there were numerous provinces across the Ottoman Empire where these dynamics that shaped the Armenian genocide were substantiated. The most important factor underlying the active participation of local elites, for instance, and notables in the extermination of the Armenians in Anatolia was the motivation to acquire the property and wealth belonging to Armenians. More importantly, this motivation made those who profited from this process even more loyal to each other and the CUP regime. In order to realize its extermination policies against Armenians, the Union and Progress Party had to make concessions. Thus, the motivation that brought the Muslim elites of various provinces and towns into CUP's power and its policies of extermination was not only a shared ideological principle, but rather the self-interest of these perpetrators. In return, the CUP greatly expanded the scale of complicity and in a sense actually spread the crime to the grassroots. What is meant by complicity here is not only the involvement of the perpetrators or those who benefited from this process after the genocide began, but also the support and the consent of different segments of society to the extermination of Armenians in the first place. This support and consent serve as a litmus test for their loyalty to the regime and to its ideals. My whole point is to focus on the neighborhoods where the genocidal violence took place. In essence, to look at the places where the moment of explosion of violence and the subsequent process took flesh and bones. To see how the dimension of this tremendous violence that we call genocide materialized in these places. This includes deportation, physical violence, forced conversion, plundering of wealth, and etc. In order to capture the whole story, it's essential to go to the crime scene. In moments of violence, it's important to understand the complex relationship between the perpetrator and the victim, to see the positions and situationalities taken by both actors. Perpetrators such as Talat, Enver, Cemal, Bahattin Shakir, Dr. Nazım, Ziya Gökalp, Dr. Rashid, etc., who were at the top or the core of the CUP hierarchy and who organized the massacres, were distinguished as ideological elites. Although complex and diverse, ideological commitment fulfilled an extremely important dual function among these perpetrators. Ideology provides motivation and thus a common orientation for actors with various conflicting interests. The ground and the environment in which the CUP coordinated the genocide is also characterized by this diversity. It's possible to list the main motivations that drive a perpetrator who participates in mass killings as revenge, carrierism, greed, plunder, and acting in concert with the herd. Most perpetrators know the victims personally, having previously lived with them in relative harmony as neighbors or colleagues. Contrary to this view in my work, I try to shift the focus from impersonal institutions and abstract structures to the flesh and blood actors who perpetrated these massacres in order to understand the real dynamics of mass killings. As Christopher Browning, who has done important work on ordinary perpetrators in the context of Holocaust, he emphasizes if ordinary Serbs, Croats, Turks, Cambodian, and Chinese can be perpetrators of genocide, the point to be made here is the universal aspects of human nature that transcend the cognition and culture of ordinary Germans. According to Browning, genocide perpetration is part of the human experience and should therefore be explained in human terms. I can easily state that this study, which focuses on the acts and biographies of ordinary perpetrators of the Armenian genocide, claims to be the first with this very feature. My own work. I'm not praising my own work, I'm sorry. So, in a sense, This is also the first time that we focus on the daily life practices of these perpetrators during the genocide. It will be useful to underline one point. The first step to create a complete perpetrator studies in the Armenian genocide literature is to focus on the dynamics of the politics of persecution, the bureaucracy of genocide, biographies of perpetrators under the leadership of the CUP, motivations of those guys who participated in mass killings beyond madness, and the interaction between racial hatred, the act of killing, and the space itself. Of course, due to the paucity and scarcity of available sources, the scope of our analysis of perpetrators' motivations in the Armenian genocide is limited in comparison to the cases of the Holocaust, Cambodia, Rwanda, Bangladesh, and Bosnia. Moreover, there is no consensus among researchers on how to understand and explain the behavior of genocide perpetrators. One group of researchers describes this behavior as abnormal and focuses on the cultural and ideological and psychological factors that cause it. According to this view, the perpetrators of such massacres are individuals who have deviated from what is normal. Most societies do not commit genocide, and most of the people belonging to these societies are not perpetrators of genocide. These are acts of extraordinary evil and occur in abnormal times. So I challenge this approach and argue that mass killings such as ethnic cleansing and genocide can also be committed by ordinary and normal people. What is meant by ordinary here is the way they perceive the nature of the crime they have committed and are complicit in, and their attitudes towards it. The total extermination of the Armenians was the first time in modern history that a government considered a certain group of its own citizens as a political problem and believed that this problem would be solved by eliminating the group in question. This is, of course, a choice, a preference made by these actors who hold the power. At this point, it will be useful to substantiate what we mean by government. When we talk about the Armenian genocide, the term Ottoman government does not only refer to the Committee of Union and Progress, which held the central authority at the time, its members, or the power bloc formed by this party. At the same time, there is another power bloc consisting of the civil and military bureaucrats of the central authority in the provinces, districts, and towns, and the local elites represented by the notables in these areas. In essence, it was these actors who held power at the local level and shaped the policies of the central authority. The role of these elements in the process of the Armenian genocide was often more active, more functional, more affecting than the central authority. So, approaches that view the Armenian genocide as the smooth and flawless execution of a decision made by the central government or a centralized power center overlook the fact that it was a highly complex, inconsistent repertoire of actions in which local initiatives play a crucial role. Historians and researchers studying this period need to focus on the complex and contested dimensions of the behaviors of the perpetrator at different stages of a highly intricate historical process, such as the extermination of Armenians. In doing so, the gray zone between the victims and perpetrators that Primo Levi alluded to is an important point that should not be neglected in the case of the Armenian genocide. The Armenian genocide was a mass murder perpetrated by a wide range of perpetrators. The individuals involved in this collective crime participated in these criminal acts in accordance with their own decisions, regardless of the circumstances. Therefore, individual responsibility is essential here. To claim that this massacre was carried out solely by a group led by the CUP would first and foremost causes us to ignore the mass dimension of the event and the individual and collective responsibility of the people who voluntarily participated in these crimes. In this regard, it's necessary to develop a new paradigm by shifting our focus from the elite of the CUP to the ordinary perpetrators. So, when we talk about the CUP elite, are we talking about a group of people who aim to achieve the same goal through the same methods? I believe that both the constituents of the CUP and the members of the party's central committee had different agendas and the positions regarding the fate of the empire, especially in 1915 and 1917. Putting these actors with very different political, cultural, and ethnic backgrounds into a monolithic and static mold, such as central power, already makes it difficult for us to understand a violent event such as genocide and to reconstruct and interpret a case that happened in the past. Genocide was only one of the policies on the table for these decision-making actors. They might not have preferred it. However, many different dynamics, especially the war, presented them with an alternative of making such a decision, of making such a choice. The main issue here is the action itself. The name of the action in question is extermination. In other words, to render a group that you see as a threat to your existence ineffective and non-threatening to you. The genocidal characterization of extermination is the radicalization and escalation of the related violent actions. You cannot evaluate the perpetrators of these acts, those who carry out these acts, whether centralized or local, by putting them in the same category. You also need to consider the positions, strategies, attitudes, and power relations between the political representatives and the decision makers of the victim group. We need to subject the interaction, unrest, disagreements between the perpetrator and victim groups, the nature of the decisions they took as a result of all these and the processes that push them to take these decisions, to careful historical readings. Otherwise, it will be really difficult for us to understand the dynamics that made the Armenian genocide possible. Because compared to Holocaust, Cambodia, Rwanda, we are faced with a genocidal case with the lowest probability and expectation of realization. Even if a clear and unambiguous extermination order was sent from the center to many provinces, what matters to me as a historian is how this order was received, reacted, and positioned by the relevant individuals, institutions, and groups. The only way to understand this is to go down to the scene of the event, that is to focus on the local, to look at the communication and interaction of the actors here with each other, and the political agenda of each and every group. Our job is to show whether genocide happened or not. It should not be to prove it. As historians, we have only one task, and that is to present what happened, taking into account all variables, all available narratives and sources. Compared to other genocidal events, I think that the Armenian genocide has not been sufficiently studied on a micro level. In other words, various issues such as how the event unfolded in the places where it took place, how the elements that allow and enable genocide came to the fore, what were the motivations and processes that brought those who decided to commit genocide to this point, and a comparative analysis of whether the policies of violence against different ethnic groups in empires such as Tsarist Russia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire were nourished by the same climate, while this happened to Ottoman Armenians, are still waiting to be researched. Let me give you one example. During the First World War, Tsarist Russia imposed an ethnicity regime by categorizing its own citizens who were not ethnically Russian, especially Germans, Jews, and Muslims, under the category of enemy citizens. This regime was completely discriminatory, segregating, and destructively violent. However, only the Ottoman Empire took this dynamic of destruction to genocide. In addition, the Austro-Hungarian state committed many mass murders under the pretext of military security, but never with genocidal consequences. I believe that comparative analysis such as this one will open the door to new research topics. Of course, one of the important problems here is the small number of researchers who speak Armenian and who understand, who read, and the lack of access to documents in Ottoman and General Staff archives in Turkey. For example, in some catalogs related to deportation, especially the abandoned properties. In addition, one of the significant disadvantages I see is that, compared to, again, other mass violent events, the testimonies of the Armenian genocide are extremely limited, and almost all of the perpetrators passed away. This makes it particularly difficult for us to identify the motives and the motivated those who participated in the genocidal process. In addition, historians and researchers studying the Armenian genocide, especially late Ottoman historians, have always tried to deal with this issue through a mess of documents and have not taken into account the collective violence aspect of the issue. You cannot fully evaluate Hamidian massacres of 1895, Adana pogrom of April 1909, and the 1915 Armenian genocide without including the literature on mass violence. We need to keep in mind the fact that violence is a part of our daily lives. One of the main shortcomings of the Armenian genocide study is the isolation of the issue of collective violence from social and political fields such as the history of everyday life, even the failure to explain the social mechanisms of the event by relying on documents in some studies. So, the examples I have just mentioned in the case of Holocaust, Rwanda, Bosnia, and Indonesia, and so forth, show us how important local dynamics are, how violence spreads to the grassroots in waves, how socio-political conditions prepare the circumstances for a destructive environment of violence, the diversity, normality, and ordinariness of the perpetrators of violence, and how ordinary and normal people who know each other, who are connected to each other through kinship and neighborhood ties, can come to the point of destroying each other on both micro and micro levels. In this context, it's possible to argue that these examples can serve as litmus tests for a better understanding and explanation of the Armenian genocide. I believe that studies that treat the genocide as an event carried out by actors such as Talat Enver and Cemal, Bahattin Shakir and Dr. Nazım, and etc., that see it within the framework of a process of social engineering and Turkification, Islamization, and that constantly attempt to prove an event of destruction on documents are outdated. Therefore, any dialogue and communication that the Armenian genocide literature can establish with these examples is extremely important in terms of showing the complex content of the violence in question befallen the Armenians. Having said that, my recent book brings back the notion of class, for instance, which has experienced an eclipse in recent years in genocide studies. My book shows that economic and political, ideological interests of the perpetrators, like the gentry, different sectors of urban population, and ordinary Muslims, did overlap in the process of Armenian persecution, and that intersection of these two interests determined the momentum and intensity of the violence. In this regard, the case of Aintab, for instance, suggests that Turkish Republic cannot be fully grasped without taking into consideration the concept of class. This is a study of the Armenian genocide, but also the biography of a city in a time of trouble and violence. By combining socio-political and socio-economic historical methods, my research treats Aintab, a microcosm, to elucidate the confiscation and transfer of Armenian properties. I show that this process is an essential component of a genocidal policy and demonstrate how plundering serves as a major incentive for garnering the support and involvement of the social notables, local notables in the Armenian genocide. So this knitted history on Aintab unveils the similarities between the massacres of 1895 and that of 1915, particularly in terms of how massacre became a means of plunder and appropriation. A more disturbing revelation is that the events of 1915 and 16 provided foundation for the establishment of the new regime starting in early 1920s. The rising elite of the newly established regime gained power and legitimacy through the cleansing of the Armenian community and spoliation its property. Their tacit partnership in crime highlights the economic motives prevalent in almost 3 decades of violence faced by minorities around the turn of the century. Local actors in Aintab and other provinces were not simply engaged in implementing orders or opposing them. Rather, they functioned as active and pivotal historical actors that was present throughout the process. Following this conceptual framework, it can be claimed that Armenian genocide was much a top-down process as it was bottom-up. The relations between the central power and local authorities were not unidirectional, but multifaceted. Genocide and plunder were certainly centrally planned, but also one facilitated by local incentives and motives. So another argument of the book is its recount of the famous Battle of Aintab, Aintab'ı Koyamalı, against the French, which resulted in the gifting of the honorific prefix Gazi in Gaziantep. The battle is narrated not as a heroic act of patriotism, but as an organized struggle of a group of genocide profiteers seeking to hold on to their loot. The afterlife of the murder and theft of World War I figures, so importantly because my work realizes much more clearly than many genocide scholars, the genocide is the force perpetrating polity a creative as much as destructive endeavor. In addition to eradicating the Armenian community, deportation was also means of guiding the Muslim population towards a new identity. Along with rewarding individual perpetrators, plunder was also a way of integrating the so-called reliable, resourcing muhajirs to the nascent Turkish Muslim bourgeois as a driver of national modernization in a Darwinian world of struggle. Post-Lausanne contortations of Turkish law ensured that Christians who had been deported in 1915 and 16 or fled later with the departing French forces could neither retain title to lost property nor demand compensation for it. Thus was the Republican regime was linked to its CUP predecessor via persecutory economic policy as well as personnel and ideology. So, most historians have had a difficult time unearthing documents that demonstrate the willful intent of the genocidaires. Therefore, Turkish people or Turkish authorities have kept most of these archives off limits to scholars or have carefully eliminated damning evidence. So, how did I get my hands on these documents then? So I must point out one thing very clearly. The government kept entire records of sales of Armenian properties, sale records, sale reports, and other transactions of the so-called abandoned properties commissions. But over the course of 1.5 years research in the Ottoman archives in Istanbul, I could not manage to obtain them, including in the Aintab branch of Abandoned Property Commission, as they were kept hidden and inaccessible for researchers. These records were essential for my book to document the so-called legal theft and the plunder and liquidation of Armenian wealth in a local place. Then something extraordinary happened. In 2015, I paid a visit to Los Angeles to meet a friend of mine who was a descendant of a genocide survivor from Aintab, the late Pakrat Kazasyan. Uncle Pakrat had been supportive of my work since we first met. He wanted to introduce me to his cousin, whose grandfather Sarkis Yakupyan was from Aintab and had survived the genocide, ending up in Aleppo, where he opened a bakery. Uncle Pakrat took me to her house. It was quite warm welcoming. After night chats and delicious food, Pakrat's cousin brought dozens of old papers and documents, all written in Ottoman Turkish, and put them in front of me. She thought that there might have been some materials that could be useful for my book. While getting lost amongst them, all of a sudden I realized that a report of the Aintab Liquidation Commission was lying in front of me, and I was reading the auction results regarding the movable assets, properties, and goods of her grandfather Sarkis Yakupyan. What the documents were telling me was groundbreaking. They clearly show and prove plunder and spoliation under the veil of legality. To date, this kind of documentation had not been done. As the relevant archives, the archives of land registry and the cadastre in Turkey are closed, I walked Aintab's old Armenian neighborhood street by street and interviewed the inhabitants of the city as well as relatives of Aintab Armenians from diaspora. In doing so, I also tried to obtain title deeds from those Armenians in diaspora in order to determine which buildings they used to own as well as the previous and present-day Muslim owners. As a result of this research, I made a list of properties and their locations along with their previous and present-day owners. This list in question can be found in the appendix section of the book. So, finally, then how do I think the burgeoning literature of the Armenian Genocide has affected the agenda and, of course, Ottoman, Republican, and Middle Eastern studies or historiography? I define the period between 1912 and 1922 as the longest decade of collective destructive violence in Ottoman Turkish history. 10 years constant violence. An empire that lost almost all of its territory in Europe and began to disintegrate, the forced expulsion and massive destruction of the elements of this empire that have been legally characterized as minorities, gayrimüslimler, since Lausanne. The mass acts of violence carried out by the CUP all over Anatolia with the support and assistance of local actors and the new nation state that rose out of this total destruction and inherited this spiral of violence. When you look at the reading list of historians who teach history, introductory Middle Eastern history, in the US and Europe today, it's impossible to find a list that does not include these events that were the product of the wave of violence that engulfed the Ottoman Empire. I know it will be a cliche, and it's still worth emphasizing. The shaping of the Middle East, the nation-state formation processes of the communities living in this geography, the state-citizen relations, formation of central and local political elites, all these processes have determined the fate of the Middle East in every sense, including the Armenian Genocide, the extermination of Assyrians, the expulsion of the Ottoman Greeks, as well as the violence against the Muslims in the Balkans and Caucasus in 1912 and 1913. It's precisely for this reason that historians working in this field today study the issue of mass violence in the late Ottoman Empire seriously and with a comparative perspective using different sources. I think this is important in terms of understanding how multinational, multi-confessional, multi-religious structures such as the Ottoman Empire, Tsarist Russia, Austro-Hungarian Empire planted fields of violence in their backyards, especially during the transition from empire to nation-state. Today, the Middle East is a part of a post-Ottoman, and that is the post-Ottoman historical trajectory, but it is also an important dynamic of a post-genocidal historical context. An inseparable whole of this process. In my opinion, it's essential for historians who want to understand the Middle East in the context of holistic and global history to take this into consideration. At this point, in order to understand and explain the phenomenon of ISIS in the Middle East, for instance, and the historical antecedents of the Yazidi genocide, without being reductionist, it's important historical methodology to look at the spiral of violence in the Ottoman Empire and the processes, mechanisms, decision-making actors, and dynamics that prepared the environment for it. So, this is also the case for the history of Turkish Republic. The continuities and ruptures between the empire and the republic are known to historians. However, I think what we should pay attention to here are the micro-narratives and micro-histories that these two processes contain within themselves. Particularly in the history of Turkish Republic, I think it's important to focus on different aspects of daily life in order to establish a dialogue between global, national, and local historical narratives. In this sense, I believe that the Armenian Genocide has dimensions that open the door to such narratives. As a historian, and perhaps even a narrator, how the historian Hayden White characterized the historian task, it's very difficult to separate your research topic from your personal history. Especially when you're working on the dark annals of your own country's history, you are sometimes a passive agent and sometimes active. It starts with your upbringing and continues in your education, and in fact, it's with you for your whole life. At some point, your people's history became part and parcel of my own history. And I did not own your people's history. On the contrary, it came to own me. So, thank you for your patience. I want to show you some images. So, this is the image of a Nazaretan family. Oh, sorry. As you see, and as you can read, that was one of the wealthiest and affluent Armenian families in Aintab. So Kara Nazar Ağa, Black Nazar Ağa. So he was the honorary consulate of American consular, and he managed to end up in Aleppo by the help of Aleppo governor Celal Bey. Celal Bey gave him an official certificate and then 2 Kurdish escorts on his way to Aleppo, but he lost all his assets, properties, inns, khans, hotels, bazaars, and beautiful house. Another Armenian family from Aintab, I wasn't able to actually identify this family, but the photo was taken by the famous photographer Halatyan in Aintab from his studio. And this is the Babikyan family, and the Babikyan family was the very first family who was deported from Aintab on August 1st, 1915. They received the first deportation notification from the local government, and along with the Karachian families. And Kevork Aslanyan. And interestingly enough, I met Dr. Aslanyan's grandson in Beirut in 2015, and I got really shocked because his grandson was a twin brother of Dr. Kevork Aslanyan. They were alike. So, and Dr. Kevork Aslanyan, so he was waived from deportation, exempted because of the nature of his job. He was a physician, so his labor was utilized by the Ottoman army. And Dr. Hovset Bezjian, the famous doctor, the head of the American hospital. The hospital was established by the American missionaries in Aintab in 1876. And Hovset Bezjian was the son of Alexander Bezjian from Aintab, and the brother of Zenok Bezjian, who was representing the whole Armenian Protestant community in the empire during the World War I. And another important, well-known family from Aintab, Cebejian family, Dr. Avedis Cebejian. He also wrote his memoir in Armenian, and it was translated into Turkish as well by Aras Publishing House. And Dr. Avedis Cebejian, he was a lieutenant in the Ottoman army in Gallipoli first, in Çanakkale, and then he was sent to Diyarbakir, and he was in Bitlis, Diyarbakir, and he saw with his own eyes the atrocities and the destruction and demolition of houses in Diyarbakir, Bitlis, and Mameretul Aziz Karpet as well. And he wrote all these scenes and records in his memoir, in his diary. So Avedis Cebejian, and his house now, he had a big house, the mansion. It's being used now Atatürk Cultural Center in Antep. So why am I showing all these family photos? I think now what we need is more work on the history of these families, and we need to really, we need to understand the real dynamics of also the Armenian life, even under the genocidal circumstances. We need to understand and what were their survival mechanisms, how they stood, how they resisted, and also what happened to those families aftermath of the genocide, and so on and so forth. I think all these issues beg for more exploration and more research in our field. Yeah. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kurt, and we're going to open it up for questions, comments, but let's make it brief questions to start with, and then give everyone a